For years, the Queen had watched Charles move between duty and desire, believing time would force him to make the decision he kept avoiding. But on one private night inside the palace, patience ended and the monarch demanded an answer that would permanently fracture the royal family. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, because this royal confrontation was only the beginning, and the choice Charles made would leave scars that no crown could hide. From the outside, the monarchy still looked calm. Royal duties continued. Smiles appeared when they were expected. Every public event was handled with care, and every painful rumor was pushed behind palace walls. But inside the family, the pressure was growing. Charles was caught between the life he had promised to protect and the woman he could not leave behind. For a long time, the Queen believed silence was safer than conflict. She had heard the whispers, witnessed the tension, and received reports of private arguments. Yet she feared that confronting Charles too directly might turn a hidden scandal into an open disaster. That fear began to change when Diana's unhappiness became impossible to ignore. Senior members of the household noticed the strain in her voice, the sudden mood changes, and the growing distance between husband and wife. This was no longer a normal marriage in trouble. It was becoming a danger to the crown itself. Diana was loved by the public, but behind the praise, she felt trapped, rejected, and deeply alone. The more she suffered, the harder it became for the palace to pretend that nothing was wrong. Then came the reports the Queen could no longer dismiss. Charles was still emotionally tied to Camilla. Warnings had been given, expectations had been made clear. He was supposed to protect his marriage, his position, and the future of the monarchy. Instead, he continued living between two loyalties, hoping neither side would force him to choose. But the Queen's greatest fear was not only scandal. It was William and Harry. She feared the boys would grow up surrounded by bitterness, secrets, and divided love. She also feared that Charles's weakness could damage the public's trust in the next generation before it had even begun. So the private meeting was arranged. Doors were closed. Aides were dismissed. Sensitive papers were removed. Charles was summoned without an explanation. At first, he expected another warning about public behavior and palace image. But the moment he entered, he understood. His mother was not speaking as a worried parent. She was speaking as the sovereign. Her voice remained calm, but there was no softness in it. The excuses, she told him, were finished. He would not leave that room still divided. He would choose Diana, or he would choose Camilla. Charles had spent years believing he could survive between two worlds. But the Queen was about to force him to destroy one of them with a single answer. Before the Queen confronted Charles, another voice had already reached her not through a public accusation, but through a private appeal filled with fear, humiliation, and desperation. Diana was no longer asking the palace to save her marriage. She was asking whether anyone inside it still believed she mattered. Her pain did not arrive as a loud accusation. It came quietly, through a trusted person who understood how dangerous it was to carry such a message inside the royal household. Diana knew that every word could be used against her. If she sounded too angry, she could be called unstable. If she spoke too openly, she could be accused of damaging the monarchy. If she remained silent, the life she was living would continue to break her piece by piece. So she chose her words carefully. She did not begin by demanding that Camilla disappear. She did not ask the Queen to punish Charles. What she wanted first was something far simpler and far more painful. She wanted honesty. She wanted Charles to stop asking her to smile in public while making her feel unwanted in private. She wanted the palace to admit that the marriage was not what the world had been told it was. Diana feared that the family no longer saw her as a wife with feelings, hopes, and dignity. She believed they saw her mainly as the mother of William and Harry, a woman whose duty was to protect the future of the crown no matter what it cost her. Her public success only made the private suffering harder to explain. Crowds loved her. People reached for her hand. Yet inside the marriage, she felt pushed aside. The most painful part of her appeal came when she explained how Charles had made her feel like a stranger in her own home. Camilla, Diana believed, was the person Charles trusted with his fears, thoughts, and private feelings. Diana carried the title, the duties, and the public pressure, but another woman seemed to hold the part of him that mattered most. The Queen was deeply disturbed by what she heard. Still, she remained careful. To fully accept Diana's story would mean admitting that the palace had failed to control Charles and had allowed the marriage to decay behind a perfect public image. That truth carried its own danger, but the Queen also understood that this was no longer simple jealousy. Diana's despair was growing, and pain that deep rarely stayed hidden forever. One day, she might speak without permission. She might challenge the silence that had protected the family for generations. That possibility frightened the Queen almost as much as Diana's suffering. She felt sympathy for her daughter-in-law, but she also feared Diana's honesty, emotional power, and refusal to keep pretending. The coming confrontation with Charles would be driven by compassion, but also by the need to stop the truth from escaping palace control. Diana's plea had placed the truth directly before the monarch, but the Queen still needed to hear whether her son would protect his wife, his children, and the crown, or abandon them for the woman he refused to release. When Charles entered the Queen's private room, he expected protocol, restraint, and another carefully worded warning. Instead, he found something far more dangerous: a mother who believed her son had betrayed his family, and a monarch who feared his weakness could bring down everything she had protected. There was no formal greeting, no polite question, no soft beginning to ease him into the subject. The Queen refused to let ceremony protect him. Charles had spent years hiding behind rank, duty, and carefully chosen language, but this time there was nowhere to retreat. She wanted the truth, and she wanted it without the usual royal excuses. Charles tried to explain that Camilla was not simply an affair. He described her as the one person who understood the pressure placed upon him. With her, he claimed, he could speak freely. He could admit his fears without being judged. Diana, he argued, could not understand the weight of being heir to the throne or the loneliness of living a life designed by others. The Queen did not accept it. Duty, she reminded him, had never been easy. Every generation had been forced to give up something personal for the crown. Charles was not the first royal to feel trapped, and he would not be the last. His pain did not give him the right to make others suffer in silence. That answer pushed years of resentment to the surface. Charles insisted that the institution had helped create the disaster. He had been guided toward a marriage that looked right to the public, while the woman he trusted was pushed aside as unsuitable. Now, he said, the same people who shaped his future were blaming him because the plan had failed. The Queen's anger sharpened. She would not allow him to turn Diana into the face of every decision made by advisors, relatives, and palace officials. Whatever pressure had led to the marriage, Charles was still responsible for what happened afterward. He had chosen secrecy. He had chosen distance. He had allowed Diana to carry the shame of a broken marriage while he searched for comfort elsewhere. Then, the Queen spoke about William and Harry, and the argument changed. William was old enough to feel the coldness between his parents. Harry was watching too, learning what loyalty meant from adults who kept hurting one another. Their childhood was being shaped by whispers, anger, and divided love. Charles became defensive the moment Camilla's name was criticized. His voice changed. His excuses became firmer. Even under pressure, his first instinct was to protect her, not Diana. The Queen saw it clearly. She gave him two choices: end all private contact with Camilla and commit fully to Diana, or admit that he was choosing Camilla and face what followed. Then came the silence. It was long enough for Charles to understand that this was not only a mother's warning. The monarch was preparing to use the power of the crown. The choice had finally been spoken aloud, but Charles's hesitation revealed something more shocking than any confession. He already knew which woman he could not bear to lose. The Queen expected anger, bargaining, perhaps even a promise Charles would later struggle to keep. What she did not expect was the cold certainty of his reply. In a few restrained words, he made clear that Diana could remain his wife, but Camilla was the person he considered impossible to surrender. For several long moments, Charles said nothing. The silence was not empty. It carried years of anger, fear, duty, and buried regret. He knew this was not only about two women. It was about the life chosen for him, the role he had been trained to accept, and the part of himself he believed the monarchy had never understood. He was weighing love against obligation, but he was also deciding whether he would obey the crown or defend the one relationship that felt like his own. When he finally spoke, he did not say, "I choose Camilla." His answer was more careful than that, but no less painful. He insisted that ending his bond with her would destroy the only part of his life that felt emotionally true. Camilla, he said, understood him without demanding that he perform. With her, he did not feel like an heir, a symbol, or a man trapped inside a plan created by others. Diana, however, was described in a different language. Charles spoke of marriage, responsibility, the children, public duty, and the future of the monarchy. He spoke of what Diana represented, but not of what she meant to him. The difference was devastating. Diana belonged to the life he was expected to protect. Camilla belonged to the life he wanted to keep. The Queen understood the truth at once. Charles had divided his world into two separate parts and expected both women to live inside the roles he had given them. Diana would carry the title, the pressure, and the public smile. Camilla would hold his trust, comfort, and private heart. The Queen asked whether he understood what this answer would do to Diana. Charles replied that reconciliation had already become impossible. He pointed to Diana's anger, her emotional reactions, and her growing refusal to follow palace rules. In doing so, he turned her pain into proof against her. That was the moment the Queen's disappointment became colder. She no longer saw only a confused son. She saw a future king willing to defend his happiness by explaining away another person's suffering. Charles still believed the monarchy would adjust. It needed him as heir, and he trusted that his position would protect him from any lasting punishment. The Queen warned him that birth could secure a title, but it could not secure respect. A crown could be inherited. Trust could not. And if he continued down this path, he might lose not only his mother's confidence, but the faith of William and Harry. She gave him one final chance to reconsider. Charles did not move. He did not withdraw his words. He allowed the silence to become his answer. Charles had made his choice, but he had underestimated the woman sitting across from him, and the Queen was now prepared to show him that every royal decision carried a price. The Queen did not shout, threaten exile, or create a public scandal. Her punishment was quieter and far more royal. Within days, doors began closing around Charles, invitations changed, trusted aides became cautious, and Camilla discovered that the sovereign could make a person disappear without ever announcing a ban. This was how royal power worked at its coldest. It did not need to leave marks. It moved through schedules, guest lists, private briefings, and carefully delayed messages. Nothing looked personal. Every change could be explained as routine. Yet Charles understood almost at once that the ground beneath him had shifted. Meetings he once expected to attend suddenly continued without him. Important discussions about the future of the monarchy were held in smaller circles. Papers arrived late. Advice was offered through others instead of directly. These were not public humiliations, but they carried a clear message. The queen no longer trusted him as she had before, and his preparation for kingship was no longer beyond question. Camilla felt the pressure in a different way. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends who once welcomed her began making excuses. Some were quietly warned that bringing her near royal gatherings could cost them their own place inside those circles. No official ban was issued. None was needed. The fear of displeasing the queen did the work. Inside the palace, staff received careful instructions. Private calls were harder to arrange. Travel plans were watched more closely. Opportunities for secret meetings began to disappear. Anyone helping Charles avoid these limits risked being noticed, questioned, or removed. The goal was not simply to embarrass him. It was to cut Camilla off from the hidden system that had allowed their relationship to survive. Charles was furious. To him, these steps proved that the monarchy had never respected his feelings. He saw the restrictions as an attack on his independence, not as punishment for the pain he had caused. The more control the queen used, the more he believed he was being treated like a prisoner inside his own family. Then came the most serious move of all. A confidential review began inside Charles's household. His spending, travel, private schedule, and closest staff were examined. Loyal aides suddenly feared for their positions. The people who had protected his secrets could now be replaced by those loyal to the sovereign. But the pressure did not make Charles surrender. It made him more careful. Trusted friends carried messages. Private homes became meeting places. Plans were hidden inside ordinary arrangements. What had once been reckless now became organized resistance. And somewhere inside that tightening circle, someone began keeping records. Dates, calls, visits, names, each note seemed harmless alone, but together they could expose the entire secret structure. The queen believed isolation would weaken Charles's devotion, but every closed door pushed him deeper into defiance, and Diana was about to learn exactly what he had chosen. Diana had feared the answer long before anyone confirmed it, but hearing that Charles had defended Camilla before the queen transformed suspicion into something final. The marriage was no longer failing because Charles was confused. It was failing because, when forced to choose, he had decided Diana was the sacrifice. Before anyone spoke to her directly, Diana sensed that something had changed. Staff members avoided her eyes. Conversations ended when she entered a room. Messages became shorter. Doors closed more quickly. Charles, already distant, seemed colder than before. His silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt settled, as though a decision had been made somewhere beyond her reach. The queen did not repeat every word from the confrontation. She did not describe each pause, each excuse, or every moment Charles defended Camilla. But she said enough. Charles had refused to end the bond. He had not chosen the marriage in the way Diana had once hoped he might. That truth landed with a force far greater than any public insult. Diana did not shout. She did not break down in front of the people around her. She became quiet. That silence was more disturbing than anger, because it showed how little strength she had left to fight for the same love. For years, she had believed that time might change him. She had believed the children, royal duty, or the weight of public expectation might finally pull Charles back toward the life they had promised to share. Now that final hope was gone. She asked the queen whether Charles would be forced to change. The answer was careful. There was talk of patience, privacy, protecting William and Harry, and avoiding further damage. But Diana heard what remained unsaid. The queen disapproved of Charles's choice, yet Diana was still expected to smile, attend public duties, and protect the image of a united family. That contradiction changed something inside her. The palace could punish Charles in private, but it still wanted Diana to carry the public burden. She was expected to protect the very system that had failed to protect her. So she stopped asking how to win him back. Instead, she began protecting her own truth. She remembered dates, conversations, broken promises, and private humiliations. She held on to details others might later deny. It was not revenge. It was survival. Her bond with William and Harry deepened because she feared that one day they might hear a cleaner, safer version of the story. She could not allow them to believe her pain had been an inconvenience or that her silence meant consent. In that quiet turning point, Diana made a promise to herself. Charles, Camilla, and the palace would not be allowed to write the final account of what had happened to her. The palace believed Diana had been contained by heartbreak, but it had created something far more dangerous, a woman who no longer feared losing the marriage because she understood it had already been taken from her. For Camilla, Charles's answer should have been the ultimate proof of devotion. He had defended her before the most powerful woman in Britain. Yet the victory came with a terrifying realization. Being chosen by Charles did not mean being accepted by the monarchy, and the Queen now viewed her as a threat. When Charles told her what had happened, Camilla felt a rush of relief. He had not abandoned her. He had stood before the Queen and refused to cut her out of his life. For a moment, that loyalty seemed to settle every doubt she had carried. But the comfort did not last. The more Charles explained, the more dangerous his choice began to sound. Camilla had never truly expected him to destroy his position, his family, or his future for her. Their relationship had survived because it remained hidden, controlled, and protected by people who understood the value of silence. She believed secrecy gave them safety. Charles now seemed ready to challenge the palace itself, and that kind of devotion could expose everything they had tried to preserve. He spoke with new determination, as though the Queen's pressure had only strengthened his need to prove that no one could separate them. Camilla reacted with caution. She warned him that defiance would not make them free. It would make them targets. Charles heard fear in her words, but he also heard something that wounded him. After choosing her, he expected certainty in return. Then, the Queen's punishment began reaching Camilla directly. Invitations disappeared without explanation. Friends who once spoke freely became nervous. Private gatherings suddenly felt closed to her. Warnings arrived through careful conversations, never in writing and never with the Queen's name attached. The message was still clear. Camilla was being pushed away from every space where royal trust, access, and protection mattered. Her feelings toward Diana became even more tangled. She felt jealousy because Diana held the title and public place Camilla could never claim. She felt guilt because Diana's pain was becoming harder to ignore. She also felt resentment because Diana's popularity gave her a kind of power that rank alone could not create. The public loved Diana with an intensity Camilla feared could one day turn against anyone seen as responsible for her suffering. Camilla urged Charles to repair appearances with his wife. She did not tell him to give Diana his heart. She wanted him to lower the tension, protect the children, and prevent open war. But Charles took her advice as distance. For the first time, the choice he had made for Camilla began creating a fracture between them. And so Camilla kept what she could. Letters, promises, private words, and details Charles might later deny. They were signs of love, but they were also protection in case the palace forced him to retreat. She had won his answer, but victory had brought no crown. It had brought Diana's enemies, the Queen's suspicion, and the threat of public hatred. Charles had chosen Camilla, Diana had chosen to remember, and the Queen had chosen control, but someone inside the palace was preparing to turn their private war into a public catastrophe. The palace had survived forbidden love before, but this secret carried something more destructive, proof that Charles had been given a final chance to protect Diana and refused. When whispers of the Queen's ultimatum escaped, the scandal was no longer about romance, it became a judgment on his character. At first, the story moved quietly through old friends, former aides, and people who had once been trusted with private arrangements. A date appeared here. A remembered conversation surfaced there. Then came details so exact that senior officials could no longer dismiss them as empty gossip. Someone knew what had happened behind the closed door. Worse, someone appeared ready to prove it. The palace responded in the way it always did. There were calm denials, careful phrases, and claims that private family matters had been twisted for attention. But the more officials tried to reduce the story, the larger it became. This was no longer only about Charles loving Camilla while married to Diana. It was about a choice. He had allegedly been told to protect his wife, his children, and the future of the crown. Yet he had refused to give up the woman he believed understood him. That changed how people viewed everything that followed. Diana's loneliness no longer seemed like the result of a marriage that had simply failed. It looked like the price of a decision made by the man beside her. Her anger, pain, and public honesty took on a deeper meaning. She had not been fighting a misunderstanding. She had been living with the knowledge that when Charles was forced to choose, she was not the person he fought to keep. For the Queen, the leak brought a private defeat. Her ultimatum had not repaired the marriage. It had not ended Charles's attachment to Camilla. It had not protected Diana from humiliation. Instead, it had created a clear moment that could now be used to judge the entire family. The decision meant to restore control had become evidence that control had already been lost. William and Harry carried the consequences in different ways. As they grew older, they could no longer be protected by soft explanations. They began to understand that their mother's suffering had not been invisible. The adults around her had seen it, discussed it, and still failed to stop it. That knowledge could not be buried beneath titles or duty. Charles eventually faced the cost of the answer he once believed the monarchy would absorb. He kept Camilla, but lost Diana's trust. He defended his private truth, but weakened his mother's faith in him. He protected the relationship that gave him comfort, yet damaged the bond his children had once expected to depend upon. And even when Camilla stood beside him openly, the past did not disappear. Her place came with the shadow of every private warning, every closed door, and every wound left behind. Charles had made his choice in seconds, but the consequences lasted for decades. The monarchy survived, yet survival was not victory. The crown remained, while the family beneath it carried damage that ceremony, power, and royal jewels could never fully hide. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel for more dramatic stories about royal secrets, hidden betrayals, forbidden relationships, and the private battles that changed the British monarchy forever.